Hello, I am here to review the autobiography of Malcolm X. This book was published in 1965. It was the result of a series of interviews that Alex Haley, who was a journalist and would later become a well-known novelist, did with Malcolm X. So it starts with this book is the story of the entirety of Malcolm X's life. It starts with his birth and ends with with Alex Haley narrating the events leading up to and immediately following his assassination. So we open in Lansing, Michigan, where Malcolm X lived his childhood. His father was a preacher who was a follower of Marcus Garvey, who was kind of trying to get blacks to move to Africa, to Liberia. And for his views, his father was lynched not by the KKK but by the Black Legion, which I guess is sort of basically the same thing, but they wore black instead of white robes. And soon after Malcolm X's father was killed, his mother kind of went insane and spent most of the rest of her life in a mental institution. So Malcolm X ends up spending most of the rest of his childhood in foster homes. So he talks about in school wanting to be a lawyer, but when he told a white teacher that he wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up, the white teacher was kind of like, well, you're a black person, so you probably won't be able to. You should probably go try to become a carpenter. And Malcolm X didn't want to be a carpenter, so he dropped out of school after the 8th grade and soon fell into a life of crime in New York City. And there he works intermittently as a drug dealer, a chauffeur for prostitutes, a burglar, but after a while, several years, he gets caught in a burglary and is sent to prison, where his brothers and sister introduce him to the Nation of Islam. I'll talk about the ideology of the Nation of Islam later, but he gets really enthusiastic about the Nation of Islam and decides he wants to spend the rest of his life spreading the word of black nationalism after he gets out of prison. So then after he does get out of prison, the rest of the book is narrating the spread of black nationalism and his speeches and exploits, and later on he goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca as well, and it talks about that and his interactions with leaders from other countries, of Muslims from other countries. So this book has a lot of interesting insights. So one of the ones that definitely kept coming up was sort of Malcolm X, and he talks about the way that he himself played into this before he found the Nation of Islam when he was in his life of crime, how black people tended to kind of strive to be more white. Kind of the example he repeats many times is a lot of them, he included, would dye their hair to make it lighter, so it would look more like white people's hair. And he even thinks that his father didn't beat him as much as his other siblings because he was the lightest skinned of all his siblings. And how lighter skinned blacks were just generally kind of thought to be better in black society. So, and he also has just as many strong words as he does for white people, for who he calls the black bourgeoisie, who are sort of these blacks who may have attained some kind of professional success, kind of joined the middle class, and basically try to talk like whites, act like whites, basically try to just be white. He always refers to them as quote-unquote integrated. And basically all of this is sort of validating white people's view of themselves as superior by people who are oppressed by whites. So that's interesting, both in that context and today, because I think in many ways we still live in a society where the more white you can appear and act, specifically the more white and male you can appear and act, the better. because many women find that they can only attain success if they act more like men, unfortunately. So, yeah, that's really interesting how kind of oppressed groups participate in some ways in their own subjugation in that way. So that's fascinating, and he talks about it in a variety of ways in his life of crime, in other people he talks to. He kind of sees Martin Luther King Jr. as possibly a part of that. I don't know if I agree with that, but anyway. He also talks about sort of a cycle of poverty and discrimination and crime. So a lot of professions were closed to blacks at the time. I think he talks about how like working as a janitor was like such a big deal for a black person because like that was one of the only professions open to them, and like he was like that's a big deal. So what ended up happening to a lot of blacks, and probably still happens, is because so many professions are closed to them, they fall into a life of crime like he did. And so that always puts them at risk of going to prison. And when they're in prison, of course, they aren't doing anything to improve their situation. So it's like this cycle by which their poverty is just perpetuated. So, I think that is also still relevant today. I think that still happens. We're not as explicit about it, but it is still so much more difficult for blacks or any people of any minority and women to get financial success, to, climb the socioeconomic ladder, basically. And so that doesn't necessarily always lead them to crime, but it does make sure that they can't get out of their disadvantaged position. So that is interesting and sad. But so the Nation of Islam that Malcolm X joins, I want to talk about that a little bit. So he isn't just about getting rights for blacks. He actually says that when he was in the Nation of Islam, that he believed that whites were the devil, that not only were whites evil, but they were actually inferior to blacks, and that and he doesn't just attack whites for their oppression of blacks, but for their oppression of all non-white people, as whites did in the age of colonialism. So he expresses a lot of anger at white people for, not only at conservative kind of Southerners who want to keep segregation, but also at Northern liberals who kind of sit on their high horse and say, well, look at us, we're not racist. And he was just like, well, but just because you claim not to be racist doesn't mean you don't do things that have racist outcomes. John Oliver talked about this, actually, in his segment on school segregation, and how these days, actually, still, the most segregated school system is actually New York City, which is like a hotbed of liberalism. So, he doesn't save any of his fire for the liberals or the conservatives. I mean, yeah. So, a lot of people did call him a racist, and I think these days a lot of people would say, well, if he were a white man, he would be called a white supremacist. But what those people would be missing is the fact that he had a good reason to be angry. He had firsthand experience with the way that blacks were oppressed and kept oppressed. And unlike whites, blacks have these very real, tangible obstacles that are put in front of them for no reason other than that they're black. So he had a good reason to express his anger. Whites don't have a good reason to think that whites are superior. Whites have for so long been the most privileged group in history. So yeah, that's what I would say to those people. Later in the book, Malcolm X does soften his tone a bit. Earlier in the book, he says he believed that that there shouldn't be intermarriage, that whites and blacks shouldn't get married. In fact, he talks about an anecdote where a white Southern woman like wants to goes up to him and is like, I want to help. What can I do? As a white person, what can I do to help you? And he basically just says nothing. Uh, he basically just thinks that whites, at that point, he just thinks that whites are evil or not so evil, but that they can't help and that they just need to stay out of his way. But later in the book, specifically after his pilgrimage to Mecca, where he meets a lot more kind of Muslims outside of the Nation of Islam, what he calls white Muslims, although they're Arabs, so not like stereotypical white people, I guess, but non-black Muslims. And after that, he softens his tone. He begins to think that this intermarriage issue is more of a personal thing, that he seems to accept it, and he seems to think that white people aren't evil, that white people can help, and as long as they're doing their part to, end racism themselves, they're fine. And he focuses more on kind of the system that makes whites racist, as well as making blacks oppressed. So, yeah, this is just a really interesting, complicated narrative of the development of this man's ideas. And I'm sure it will stand up to a rereading. Definitely an important read. Definitely everyone should read this. And especially white people, I think. Yeah, it may get a bit repetitive for some people. He goes through his kind of black nationalist ideology many times in many different speeches and things, but not in a way that will keep you from finishing the book at all. And also, I think it's important to hear those a lot, because I just think white people can't be told enough that that they've done some terrible shit to non-white people. So I don't think that's really a knock against the book that much. So yeah, this is highly recommended, required reading in my opinion. Yeah, that's what I have. Thank you. Bye.